It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm obviously a big fan of this place and of this program and of Anne and her wonderful team. Um, what I like to do in these events is not to try to tell you about how to do your, too gen-related work, but to go much higher. And I got Anne's permission or even invitation to do so. I'm going to give you sort of Psych 101 Express. It's not about your work. It's about how behavioral science looks at the kind of things that you're worried about, and how we should think, I think, about societal issues more generally. And then, as was mentioned, there's Ideas 42 organizations that can help you take that perspective and implement it if you wish to do so. So my agenda for today is really to give you a behavioral view of human nature, what we have come up with in behavioral science over the last few decades. I'm going to focus on three main issues: the power of context, the importance of construal. All these will become obviously clearer in a minute, and the importance of cognitive limitations and capacity, and we'll discuss some policy implications and implications for your work. People who have heard me before know that I cannot start any of these very general Psych 101s without a very specific set of studies. I'll give you one of them. These are, you've seen these before, they're part of popular culture. I'm going to give you my specific rendition of it. These are studies that came out of basically post-Second World War, social psychologists trying to understand, the German mind. We now, of course, know there's nothing German about it. It's the mind that all of us carry behind the eyes and between the ears, but it took a while. And let me give you one specific description in some detail. This is Stanley Milgram, who's working at that point at Yale. He brings subjects to the basement of the psych department at Yale to participate in a study. These are middle-aged men. The guy in the black suit, he's the subject. The person sitting down, he's going to be the student in the white shirt. He's a Confederate. He's an actor working for the experimenter who is in the white robe introducing them. The study is irrelevant. I teach you paired associates, house, banana. Later when I say house, you, the student, are supposed to say banana. If you get it right, bravo, we move on. If you get it wrong, I give you a slight electric shock. And these shocks get progressively higher. The student is sitting pseudo-connected to these shocks and is acting. The subject, the teacher, goes to the other side of the partition and administers these questions. And this study is very carefully choreographed. It follows a very specific pattern. So if the subject chooses to administer these shocks in increasing intensity, the grunts get louder. If he chooses to go up to 150, the actor, the student, screams, "Get me out of here, I told you I have heart trouble," which he happens to mention when they first meet. If you choose to go up to 270, there is massive screams of agony. Parts of the originals were recorded. They're actually available on PBS should you choose to listen to it. And if the subject continues up to 330, when he says house and no banana comes back and he gives 330, there's total silence. 330, 340, 350, 360, up to 450. If you choose to do so, you ask the question, there's nothing coming back after the guy screamed and told you his heart trouble, and you can go up to 450. This is the setup. This is a close-up of the machine. Why would anybody do this? Well, there is this very respectable dude working for Yale University in a white robe that seems very confident, who insists it's very important that you continue. The study requires that you go on, et cetera. That's the sort of pressure that you get. So that's a study. Milgram, who's a brilliant experimenter, had the very important insight to describe this to people in much more detail than I just gave you, and all the nuances, and ask them to predict what will people do. So this is important data. We know that the US in the 70s, everybody predicts disobedience. The average prediction is at 135 volts. When the grunts get sort of loud, people will refuse to go on. No one predicts anybody will go above 300, except for the psychiatrists who Milgram interviews at the time, who recognize that 1 in 1,000 will be a sociopath who will go up to 450. Those are the predictions. The findings are that 65% of the subjects are sociopaths, and that everybody goes above 300. Now, we can spend a lot of time on this. Number one, this is we have a proof. It's a genuine discovery about human behavior. The experts about human behavior 50 years ago, 40 years ago, simply did not know it. Milgram, if you look at his correspondence with NIH, it's quite remarkable. He's planning to show the opposite. He's planning to show the American independent spirit, and he can't get it. He then replicates this in Bennington, sort of the bastion of leftist liberalism, and they look worse than New Haven. He can't get rid of it. And this is it's a discovery. And it's one of a family of studies that really shape how we think about human behavior today. I don't have to mention Abu Ghraib and other cases, but the important point is that the situation has an enormous impact on us, and we tend not to get it. We don't appreciate it. Most of you in this room, wrong, think that you wouldn't have been one of these subjects. I'm with you. And this is something that we know about human behavior, and we fail to incorporate it and to appreciate the impact that it can have. Of course, part of what I'll tell you today is that the situation doesn't have to involve electric shocks. It can involve how you shelf items in a supermarket, how you create a classroom, how you design an office space. These contexts, which we fail to pay attention to, have an enormous impact on what we find and what we create. So that's number one. Number two, it's a little bit more academic. I always try to emphasize what I'm going to say now is not, I'm not trying to be sophisticated. This is not, some kind of sophisticated claim. It's very basic, but has deep implications. And it's the following. If I give you a choice between two items, say a choice between two jobs or two cars, you're not choosing between those two items. You're choosing between those two items as they are represented in your mind. Now, again, this is obvious, but it's very deep. If you think, for example, of economic theory you've taken before, there's a fantastically wild idea that people choose between A or B. What is A or B? It's A or B as they are looking at them. All of behavioral economics at the end of the day is based on this simple insight, that if I describe A and B in slightly different ways, you construe them differently, you represent them differently, and end up making inconsistent choices. So this is, again, a trivial fact, but we tend not to think about it. Let me show it to you very clearly. This is a case where I can prove it, as it were. So if you're having a pretty good view of this picture, and I ask you for the 3D size, forget the three-dimensional view, just look on the screen. If you're seeing this pretty well, you will not believe me that the top and the bottom cars are the exact same size on the screen right now. What's going on here? You're construing a representation. You cannot help but use the 3D cues that are in this picture. And you construe a representation that, in this case, I can proudly announce to you is profoundly not what's in the world. What you're seeing is not what's happening in the world. And so this is one of the cases that's clear. I can try to prove this to you. I can take a line, for example, and cut and paste it 3 times. So I can try to prove it to you. Turns out it doesn't work. If I take this line and move it from covering one car to covering the third, your visual system insists that it's seeing that line expand and contract rather than believe they're the same size. It's very hard to get rid of this. So this is the phenomenon, and I cannot resist this beautiful quote from a beautiful late author, David Foster Wallace. There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" A lot of what I'll talk to you about is about the water. There is water in this picture. It's the stuff that makes you see it wrong. It's a 3D cues you're swimming in and you cannot see. And again, of course, that water is everywhere. If you read, I don't know, Michelle Alexander, Brandon Stevenson, they describe issues in the water today that most of us swimming along just do not notice. The stuff that's happening around race issues, inequality, it's stunning if you look at it from Mars, but in the water you don't see it. So what's happening partly is not just your interpretation, but you stop noticing the water around you. I don't know if any of you have seen these pictures before. So here's we're not going to take much time describing this, but think about what do you think is happening here? What are these nice young women doing? So these lovely young women are on a day off from running the ovens in a death camp in Germany. If I show you this one, you get better hints. These are the same ladies with their friends. But basically, there is water, and you stop noticing it. It's like a massive Milgram study. And this issue of the context having an enormous impact, more than we anticipate, and us not noticing it and swimming along, again, you don't need very dramatic pictures to say the things you do every day are in the midst of a context. Many of you are those old fish who notice there's something profoundly wrong with this context. And the question is how to change it for the young fish who don't know what the water is. A lot of behavioral science has looked at those sorts of things. If you haven't seen this is a classic case. As Anne mentioned, nudging is a classic instrument we have to shape a bit the context in which you swim. This is a beautiful case study. These are basically rates of organ donors in different European countries. What percentage of drivers are willing organ donors officially? If you look, it's kind of baffling. I mean, the blue countries average 94%, the yellow countries average 14%. You have Germany on one side, Austria on the other, Netherlands, Belgium. What's doing? What's doing is that you change the default. In the blue countries, you're an organ donor unless you choose not to be. In the yellow countries, you're not unless you choose to be. People basically don't do anything. And so what happens is that the default determines what country you live in. And there's many examples like this. This is an important story because it's not always like this. But in this case, for example, if you ask people in all of these countries, blue and yellow, what country would you like to drive in? They all want to be blue. And that means that if you're a responsible policymaker and you're minimally behaviorally informed, and you know this matters, you don't have the luxury to come out of a policy school, do cost benefits, and say, well, I'll just give it to the people. What's the difference? They'll choose what they want. You have the obligation to know that you have to arrange one default as opposed to the other to increase well-being in the place where you live or the place where you're ruling. And so these are the kind of issues that come up. Going a little bit closer to your world, FAFSA is a perfect example. I assume many of you have seen these sorts of studies, but it's one of the more generous benefits we give young Americans today. Take-up among eligibles is about a third. What's doing? Well, we've seen the forms before. They're not a happy story, but we're not going to change them quickly. So people have done studies. You may have seen this. This is Philippopoulos and his gang. In this case, the purple is the current rate of applications and actual matriculation in college among eligibles. What they do then, there's a question here. Maybe you're just not informed. You don't know about FAFSA. So they go to people and say, I've checked your household income, your parents, I know everything about you. You're eligible to lots of money FAFSA. Here is the form. And what you get is the green. Exactly nothing happens. Version number 3, I know everything about you. You're eligible. Here is the form. And here's a nice person who will help you fill out the form together. And matriculation goes up 25%. Now, this is deep because, 1, we know it's not that you're not informed. 2, we know that it's not you don't care or don't want to go to college. Both in the organ donation example I showed you and here, what do we know about people's desires? What do they want to do? We have no idea. If you default them into being organ donors or all donors, if you default them into being known donors and non-donors, what do they really want? What you need to do is something like this to realize, yes, if you help people, they actually want to go to college. And the help is minimal. If you did a cost-benefit analysis, what I teach our students in a policy school, and say you give somebody $60,000 benefit and they're failing to apply, what's the cost, what's the benefit? 1 hour with somebody and they're applying, the implied cost of that hour is impossible. There's something else going on, and that's the kind of thing where you shape context, you nudge people in this case, to make their lives a much better place to be. A lot of this has happened, unfortunately, for the rich rather than for the poor. So if you work in fancy companies, you get defaulted into 401ks. Beautiful studies by Dave Lapes and a lot of other people. What basically this shows is people join the company, and by random assignment, they're defaulted into either 2% or 5% of their income being, by default, moved into savings for 401k. They're given a phone number 24/7. Anytime, feel free to call and change that number. Go take it above 2%, below 5%, anything you wish. For many of these people, it's one of the biggest financial decisions they'll ever make. And what you see is that 4 years later in this study, these are people working in the same office, playing ping pong, meet at the water cooler. Those who are defaulted into higher savings will retire much richer people than those who are defaulted into lower savings. Again, I'm not going to belabor this too much, but if once you see this, you actually have a responsibility as a serious citizen not to pretend anymore that it doesn't matter. And then comes the question, what do you do instead? This is my favorite. This is a glow cap. It's a $15 plastic capsule that complains if you don't open it in time to take your medications. By complains, I mean it lights up, it shrieks, it calls you on your cell phone and sends you an email. And it's a beautiful case because these are people who have access to the medication. We've taken care of the intention. We've taken care of the access and the liquidity. They have the medication. They have to take it, and life intervenes, and they forget. And the claim is in some places like where HIV is rampant and where 70% of your medication is not 70% good, this can have an enormous life expectancy implication. Okay, again, the intention is not the issue is how easy it is to implement. I don't want to think too long on this, but this is one of my, I don't want to say peeves, but I think we have a problem when it comes to financial literacy, which I assume for many people in this room is dear, and I'm not criticizing this as a terribly important topic. A recent meta-analysis of over 200 interventions basically finds that if you teach people financial literacy, they do better on the test and it has no impact on their lives. And if you take seriously what I'm telling you about context, it shouldn't surprise you. You teach me, I understand better, you throw me into the massively cruel, wild, unregulated American banking system, and I fail. And in some sense, the metaphor I use is if I teach you swimming, I gave you swimming 101, and I threw you into a nice, calm Geneva lake, you might look pretty good. If I gave you swimming 101 and threw you into a massively stormy sea, you drown. And that's what we're getting here. And notice this is something that Anne commented earlier. If when I teach you financial literacy, it does very little to your life, then comes the next question. Maybe you should spend that time reading books to your kids instead. Am I just wasting your time when I pretend to ameliorate it and put you back in the context where it's not enough to help you? This is a very complicated story we have to deal with when we take seriously the fact that the context shapes how able you are to perform. The book that Sendel was mentioned earlier, a wonderful colleague and friend, economist, and I wrote, was mostly motivated by this question. Poverty, if you take seriously the fact that context matters, poverty is an immensely powerful context. And if context matters, and I put you in context of poverty, a lot of things are going to happen. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but many of you know, whether you look at public health, weeding in the fields of India, parenting, finance, the poor look terrible. They do things badly. And the question is, what's doing? Now, a lot of things have been proposed, neighborhood effects, education, information, all kinds of things. I'm putting all these up here to say I'm not dismissing. All these definitely play a role. What I want to do for the next 15 minutes is something a bit different. I want to focus on just the psychology that emerges when I put you in this very powerful context, the context of not having enough, of poverty, and the behaviors that ensue. Okay, so that's the agenda. And the book that Sendel and I wrote, basically that's the point is that when I put you in context of scarcity, that produces a specific psychology. In particular, to make it very simple, you're focusing an enormous amount of your very limited cognitive resources, and I'll come back to it, on juggling everyday financial issues. And when an enormous amount of your very limited capacity is devoted to doing this, there is just less mind left for other stuff. And when you're in the context of poverty and there's less mind left for other stuff, bad things happen. That's basically the story. In the book and a lot of the work, scarcity doesn't have to be only monetary. I could spend some time convincing you that many of you are time poor in ways that are quite similar to the way that our participants are money poor, and you can in other areas, but I'm not going to spend much time of that today. What does it mean to spend your time juggling and focusing? Among other things, I'll start with the positive stuff. The poor, and I'm going to use, obviously, this word in a very vulgar way. Who are the poor, not the poor? You understand what I mean. I'm not going to get into details. These are basically the financially constrained, if you will. The poor are very good at managing and juggling everyday finances to the extent that they can manage them. So, for example, if you look at work in marketing, if you stand outside of a supermarket and somebody comes out and say, how are you today? Can I see your receipt? And then test them, how much did you pay for the sauce, for the pasta? How much did you spend in the supermarket today? The poor know the answer way better than the rich. They think about trade-offs a lot more carefully and spend more time on it. This is a cute study that we did that I like. We stood outside, we stood at the entrance to South Station in Boston, and when people came out, we gauged their household income, and then asked them, when you get into a taxi in Boston, what does the meter read? Now, it's a fun case because clearly the rich take taxis much more often than the poor, but they're much less likely to know the answer. And so the image I want to leave you with is when you're comfortable and you get into a taxi in Boston, you sit back, you look at the Charles River and say, what a beautiful day. If you're financially struggling, you're looking at the meter. Okay, that's what you get. And there's some really, here's one thing we studied, for example, it comes from marketing, which I never knew. It's on quantity surcharge. If you live in a fancy schmancy neighborhood in America, and you go to your supermarket, marketers claim that up to 25% of items in the supermarket exhibit quantity surcharge. What does that mean? It means that half a pound of carrots costs $5 and a pound costs 12. Now, if you listen to me carefully here, you say, well, no, you're confused. And the point is, no, I'm not confused. They know that you think that bigger packages cost you less per unit item, so they make you pay more for it, and you just take the bigger box and you give the company a bit of a couple of dollars gift. What marketers find is that this trick, quantity surcharge, cannot be found in supermarkets in poor neighborhoods. Because the poor look and say, oh, if I buy 2 half pounds, it's less than a pound, thank you very much. So they don't fall for it because they're paying attention. Okay, this is the kind of things you find again and again. A lot of time spent managing my daily finances, knowing the prices, attending to the trade-offs. And the point that we argue, and there's more research in the book, is you're tunneling on what's urgent. Other things that are important in the periphery are neglected. That's what you find from the research. I'll give you a couple of examples. This is a cute study, not by us, by colleagues. You ask participants to come to the lab not having had anything to drink for 4 hours. Half of them, by random assignment, are given water. The other half are given pretzels. Not a good idea when you're thirsty. And now your task is to identify words. It's a classic lexical decision task as quickly as you can. What you find is that those who just got pretzels identify thirst-related words significantly faster than those who are satiated compared to control words where you don't get it. Now, why am I telling you this? These are decisions that take between 3 and 400 milliseconds. They're unbelievably quick. They're pre-decisional, basically. What this is saying to you is that people who are thirsty walk with thirst-related words literally activated in their brain. It takes less than half a second to identify them. You're literally walking around with the brain activated around thirst. You can go to hunger. This is an incredible set of studies that we discovered when we wrote the book. If you go to nutrition conferences, any of you, everybody knows the study. And you go anywhere else, nobody knows the study. This is an incredible set of studies that came out during 1943-44 when the Allied forces realized that they're going to inherit starving people in European camps. They also realized they didn't know how to feed them, the starving. It's not a trivial task. So they hired Ansel Keys, who was a leading nutritionist in Minnesota at the time, to study how to feed the starving. To feed the starving, he had to starve people first. He got an incredibly impressive group of young men, conscientious objectors, who, because they're objecting to the good war, were eager to participate. And he starved them, not to death, but to massive discomfort. If you read the physical descriptions of the study, these guys are so weak they cannot hold their arms above their head long enough to wash their hair. They need pillows to sit down. But we look not at the physical, we look at the mental stuff. These are people who are starving. The last thing they want to do is think about food, and it's all they're thinking about. It actually gets kind of tragicomic. So these are very talented, highly educated men who are planning to open restaurants. They're memorizing recipes. They're comparing prices of foods across different magazines. At some point, the researchers feel terrible and show them a movie. And a testimonial from the participants is they showed us a movie. I couldn't care less about the love scenes. I wanted to see the meals. And so what you're getting when you read all this is that basically your entire cognitive apparatus is consumed by the thing you don't have enough of, both at the level of what you choose to talk about, as we're thinking slow, and thinking fast, things you automatically identify in half a second if you had to. That's where your brain is. Why is this important? It's important because our brains are massively limited in ways that we don't quite appreciate. When we talked about the fish last time I was here, we mentioned briefly the fact that another thing that unites us with the fish is an extremely limited capacity to attend, which is in a sense part of the tragedy. If you think about it, if we spoke for a minute about Yemen right now, most of us would be really devoted to doing something about Yemen or about childhood poverty. 30 seconds later, we're worried about how to get a taxi to the station, lunch, a talk tomorrow, and Yemen is out. If you imagine a bicameral mind, imagine a human who could look for the taxi and still work on Yemen, how different the world would be. So we all know this is not an observation, but it's actually a dramatic one. But more extreme than that, We just have incredibly limited capacity. What do I mean by that? If you look at work right now on using cell phones in cars, in about half the states now, it's illegal to use handheld phones only because it's the only thing you can sell to the American public. Every researcher knows that hands have got nothing to do with it. If you put people in simulators and have them talk on the phone, no hands held, their reaction time and their ability to detect the periphery match somebody who's legally drunk. That's how limited our brains are. There's several studies that suggest the following. If I took this half of the room right now and asked them to remember 2 digits, please don't forget 17. And this half, I said, please don't forget 7 digits, 172465512. While you're retaining the 7 and they're retaining the 2, you would eat less well. You would literally be less likely to notice a dude dressed as a clown on a unicycle going through the room. Your head is busy. And part of the implication is if you look at the juggling poor, they're walking around the world maintaining 6, 7 digits in their head. Their head is busy, and things happen. An amazing study that we describe in the book was done by sociologists. This is more relevant to some of you. This is a classroom in Connecticut where by random assignment, half the kids in the elementary school are in the quiet side of the school, and the other half are near the train tracks. So certain days, certain times during the day, a train goes through, passes out the window. Now, I ask you, are trains distracting? Yeah, they're distracting. How distracting are they? What these people find is that in 5th grade, the kids near the train are 1 year behind in academic performance. It's a massive, they then install soundproofing, the kids catch up. And again, now I ask you, imagine yourself in a perfectly quiet room, there's no trains. You're trying to do something serious and you're worried about rent for Friday or kids' school trip for on Thursday. These are internal trains. They don't have to be outside the window. If you have these trains going through your head, you're not going to be able to think clear and thoroughly and long enough to perform as well as you could otherwise. That's the idea. And we did some studies, so I'll give you a description of a couple. This is in a New Jersey mall. We asked people to participate. We paid them to sit down in front of the computer. They get scenarios very close to everyday life. So your car breaks down. It's going to cost a certain amount of money to fix. How are you going to go about taking care of this problem? The scenarios all come in 2 versions. It's called a challenging and manageable. The manageable, the car is going to cost $150 to fix, which we know from most people in the mall on that day is doable. The challenging, the car is going to cost $1,500 to fix, which we know from a number of shocking studies for about half the people in the mall is nearly impossible. So you sit there thinking about how you're going to take care of this problem, and and there's a bunch of these. While you're thinking about it, to make life interesting, we'll give you games to play, which happen to be classic cognitive psych tests. The one on the left is a divided attention test. You're supposed to respond as quickly as you can. Same side if it's a heart, opposite side if it's a flower. It's a divided attention. Imagine it like a driving test. And on the right, Raven's matrices. I know for a fact everybody here has done these because every employer, every school in the country uses this. It's the most common test of fluid intelligence on the IQ test. It's supposed to be the closest we've ever come to having a test that does not distinguish between levels of education. And so they do these divided attention and cognitive capacity of fluid intelligence tests. We divide them by household income into high and low, into rich and poor, and let's look what they do. This is them all. If you look at the rich, whether they're worrying about the manageable or challenging car, they do just as well in the divided attention. If you look at the poor, the lower income, when they're fixing the manageable car, they look exactly as capable as their rich friends. When they're worried about the car that's creating terrible problems, they drive less well. The divided attention diminishes. This is exactly, by the way, what we would get if we asked people to retain 7 digits. They do less well, and there's many studies like this, they do less well on divided attention. We go to the fluid intelligence test, the IQ. The rich don't care which car they're fixing. The poor, when they're fixing the manageable car, are statistically identical to the rich. When they're fixing the challenging, difficult car, they are significantly less capable. This is near a standard deviation. If you make certain basic assumptions about the distribution of the IQ test, these are guys who a minute ago were just as good as their rich friends. They've now lost 13 IQ points. 13 IQ points at Princeton High School where my kid goes, that's enough to take you from average to borderline gifted or from average to borderline deficient. It's a massive effect. We know from other studies, not by us, that if I kept you up all night, literally up, with Eminem blasting in the background, you would be today about 9 IQ points less capable. So think of yourself after a night without sleep. These guys who a minute ago were just as good are now functioning less well than that. It's a massive imposition on your cognitive capacity. These are American and rich, poor. We've controlled for everything, but the poor and the rich are different. It's different education, different health. Maybe there is something. We replicated this in India among sugarcane farmers because income comes in one shot and they fail to smooth. These are basically people who are poor before harvest and rich after. We run this in handheld devices in the field. I'm not going to go into the details. But basically what we get is that these guys, when they inhabit scarcity, when they don't have enough, are functioning about 10 IQ points less capable than when they're inhabiting plenty. And now this is the same dude, same weight, same education, same health. This has enormous policy implications if you take it seriously. Among other things, for example, what this suggests is that if you have somebody who doesn't have enough income, they also don't have enough bandwidth. Giving them deadlines, giving them complicated forms, it's like charging them money. It's what they don't have enough of. It's misguided to educate them by being tough when that's exactly what they're having a hard time doing, showing up on time, putting a tie, filling out the form. This is the bandwidth they're lacking. There are many other issues that come up. I'll give you one more that I think is enlightening. If you take President Clinton's 5-year welfare receipt limits, you all know that. It's a good example because it's probably not the intention. But think about it. I tell you you're going to lose your welfare in 5 years, and you're worried about lunch for Friday. What I've done now is imposed something that's going to punish you, but it totally fails to motivate you. It's totally outside your tunnel while you're struggling in the things you need to do right now. And so it's just, to the extent that it wasn't the intention, it's a bad design because I'm worrying about Monday and all of a sudden I have 4 months welfare left and nobody entered my tunnel to tell me this all throughout. Okay, so how do you design it? How do you get into people's place is one of the main challenges. I don't have to tell you this, but the context that people inhabit, those who we're most concerned with, is terribly difficult in ways that are kind of stunning. And again, I think we fail to appreciate it. We fail to appreciate the many ways in which the context is difficult. And of course, one of the implications of the studies I'm describing to you is that you take the person who's highly capable, you put them in a complicated situation, and they look less good. Now, if you infer from that they're less capable, you've missed the whole point. We did a lot of these. I don't want to spend much time. Probably the most satisfying study I've ever run involved Princeton undergraduates. I'm not going to do the details of this, but basically they're in a situation where they're trying to collect points which get converted to money. They either have enough time, so they're rich, or they don't have enough, they're poor. They have a bucket of time they can borrow if they need at predatory lending rates, like a payday loan. If they take an extra second, they lose 2. And basically what we show, forget all the details, when these kids are rich in time, they have enough, they look at this loan, they say, I'm not taking this loan, it's stupid, it's high interest. When you give them not enough time, they're stressed, they're poor, they're in scarcity, they see a couple of extra seconds, they grab them, they take this payday loan, and they leave the lab with less money. It's very satisfying because payday loans are supposed to be the classic illustration of where the poor are myopic. And what we're showing here is that Princeton students who are not at all myopic when they're comfortable become myopic when all of a sudden they need something badly. This is a very nice study we describe done by sociologists of air traffic controllers. Air traffic controller is a nice case because your difficult and easy days are basically randomly determined by weather conditions and traffic. And what these guys basically find is that these air traffic controllers on good days are much more attentive parents and better spouses than on difficult days. And again, this highlights the fact that how good a parent you are is not who you are, but the context that puts you in, which makes it easier or more difficult. Thank you, Anne, for being a devoted father. So yeah. And again, I'm trying to give you some examples that kind of leave an impression. The fact that we fail to appreciate context, okay, it goes pretty extreme. I collect these. This is one of them. If you read about General Patton's entry into the camps, he was the first to enter to liberate the camps after the Second World War. This man, is West Point educated, knows more than anybody about what's going on. He looks at these people and he says, disgusting. Not human creatures. He cannot adjust for the fact that he knows that they just spent 3 years and he thinks they're just not serious. And that's, of course, the more extreme case of what we all see every day. And so if you fail to appreciate context and you fail to interpret what you see, there is what's known as an attribution error. You think it's the person, not the context they're in. The attribution error is very powerful. It basically says, when I lose patience with my kid, it's because, I haven't slept well and Trump is president. But when you lose patience with your child, it's because you're not a good parent. That's kind of the classic fallacy. And again, this is apropos the water. If you read this stuff, if you look at these things, there's stuff that, in some sense, you're the worst audience because you're the ones who've thought about it a bit, but it's in the water in ways that people fail to appreciate. What they see is the outcome, and they fail to appreciate where it comes from, and the attribution is terribly misguided. And in some sense, you're working against that because this is the perception that's very hard to combat. If you look at stereotypes around the world, it's a lot of beautiful work, some of it by my colleague Susan Fisk. There are some places where it's better or worse to be a woman or a Muslim. It's invariably, internationally, universally terrible to be poor and homeless. You're always on the bottom left of a multidimensional scale. You're less capable, less trustworthy, less clean, less intelligent, and all that. And that has enormous implications. This is a study we did recently. I want to show you this. So here's a guy. Here he's wearing a shirt that an independent group of subjects agree is somehow poorer than this shirt. Okay, so here is poorer, here is richer. This is not about race, so we have pairs that are white and black. This guy is wearing a rich shirt here and a shirt that people think is poorer here. If you don't know, by the way, I'm not sure why, but Hawaiian shirts make you look less special. And the only question we ask people, is how competent is this person? You're seeing the exact same person in slightly different shirts. How competent is this person? This is, forget all the nuance, but this is data that you get from 1 full second of viewing all the way to 70 milliseconds. 70 milliseconds is you sort of barely know you saw anything. And that's enough to determine how you think. And you think that the same guy, when he's wearing the poorer shirt, as it were, is significantly less competent than when he's wearing the richer shirt. This is not just first impression, it's 100 milliseconds. It's before the first impression. You've already decided competence based on stuff in the water you don't even know is there. Why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because this is a 100-year-old quote that's very lovely. It basically says, this is about economists, but it could be anybody, a parent, a teacher, a taxi driver. If the outcomes you're looking for depend on human behavior, you need to understand human behavior. If you make it up, you may end up with some very bad assumptions, some bad psychology. I have a collection of bad psychology. I'll just share a couple of cool examples with you. I'll give you one theoretical, one applied. The theoretical is kind of interesting. So take Pareto Optimality. Many of you know the idea. So this wonderful Italian economist who came up with this. If there is a state in the world, in which some of us are better off and nobody is worse off, that's a good place to go. Okay, so if there's a place we can go where some of us are better off and nobody's worse, that's a preferable place. That claim is indisputable. It's logically compelling. It may not be true in dollars or yens or marks. What do I mean by that? More and more research suggests that if I gave 30 wonderful people here 100% raise in salary, and all the rest of equally deserving people a 2% raise in salary, well-being in this room may have gone down. Everybody's getting more money, but well-being may have gone down because more and more we see that people's evaluation of their well-being is not sensitive exactly to the number of dollars, but to how they're doing relative to others who are equally meritorious. And more data suggests that looking, for example, at GDP, while ignoring inequality, we miss something really deep. And that's behavioral. We could have been built different. I don't know if fish look at it this way, but we do. And for us, if you increase inequality, even if everybody's making more, it's not clear well-being goes up. More mundane example, some of you remember the two-tier welfare law. It's now been rendered illegal by the Supreme Court because it violated the freedom to travel, completely separate from what I'm talking about. But the two-tier welfare law basically said, if you're in a state that pays X dollars, you're a welfare recipient in a state that pays X dollars, and you move to state B where they pay more, for the first 12 months of residence, you're only entitled to level A, state A level payments. Okay, so if you're moving to a higher paying state for the 12 months, you get less. Why would you do this? You can see why. The policymakers have this idea that if some states paid more, all the single mothers would hop in their SUVs and drive there, and we have to stop this craziness. It's remarkable because when these laws are introduced, there is data showing the mobility from lower to higher paying states equals mobility from higher to lower paying states. People move because they got a job, because they have a sister who could pay with childcare or whatever. But notice, if you don't know how much they pay, you move because you got a job or you have a sister who can help with childcare, and this law is there. I'll give you one example. In 1993 dollars, if you're a mother of two and you moved from Mississippi to Oakland, instead of $565, which more or less allowed you to survive, you would get 120, which guaranteed your demise. So this is a policy based on an assumption that people are moving to where they pay more. And if people are moving for another reason, you're going to destroy them. That's bad psychology. I'll give you one more. This is a beautiful study in Ontario. Emergency rooms in Ontario have a problem. There's a lot of homeless people hanging around. We have to stop this problem. It's a good example because nurses and doctors clearly mean well in general. What do? The assumption is in Ontario, it's cold, and this is a good place to come. They give you a cup of hot tea. We have to stop doing this. We have to stop being nice. Don Redelmeyer, a good friend and colleague who had the suspicion something might be wrong based on some interviews, they ran a randomized control study. When the homeless came in, half of them by random assignment were given the standard treatment, as always. The other half were given compassionate treatment. An intern stuck with them, asked them what he or she can do for them, did the best they could for them, made them feel very, very good. The data were very clear. Those who got the compassionate treatment were significantly less likely to come back to this or any other hospital in the province relative to those who got the standard treatment. Turns out, if you're a homeless person, you come into the emergency room with a non-life-threatening disease, like your knee hurts. If you feel like nobody cared, you come again, or you go to another hospital. If you feel they did the best they could for you, emergency rooms are not so appealing, and then you just don't come back. So it turns out that by being compassionate, you solve the problem, that by being mean, you kept persisting and increasing. Bad psychology. We talk a lot about creating a cockpit. A lot of you are in the business of creating a cockpit. How do you design a milieu, a context that leads people to do well? I like this example because Americans have this thing about personal responsibility. No pilot, unless she takes personal responsibility, is going to make it. But in the world of aviation, if you look at examples, are really quite striking. If you design a cockpit badly, extremely good pilots, if, for example, you have to push the stick to take off rather than pull it, you kill themselves. So this is a good example because if every pilot who's going to survive is going to do the best they can. They're going to take personal responsibility. And your job now in cockpit design is to design one that allows pilots to soar rather than crash. And how do you do that? You need to do certain things where you take into account bandwidth, context, images, how people think about each other, what they do, how they design defaults in ways that help people thrive. There's one more implication that I want to briefly touch on that I think is interesting. The bandwidth limitation I'm talking to you about is the only one we got. It's the limited bandwidth I have is the thing I have that I need to use to remember to take my medication, eat healthy, pay my accounts, help my kids with their homework. It's the only one I have. That has interesting implications for program evaluation. Imagine that Treasury introduces a new banking instrument that makes my financial alphabet easier. What we typically do is we introduce this thing, come back 2 years later to see how people are doing their finances. But this may be wrong because think about it, I'm very bandwidth limited. You just made my banking easier. I might say, thank you so much, now I can spend more time with my kids' homework. But then when you come to evaluate the program, now that you've given me a friendly financial instrument, the outcome might be in my kids' grades, not in how I'm doing financially. And so how you evaluate things for agents of very limited bandwidth gets quite different from how we usually typically think about it. I'm going to take, okay, time's up. I'm going to take 3 minutes. Did any of you respond to my repeated requests to participate? It's the worst. It's like Milgram's nightmare, your audience. Okay. Your loss, but I'll give you just to leave you a couple of thoughts. I'll give you a couple of quick slides from research we're doing right now that I'm finding intriguing. We give people descriptions of everyday social discomforts. Heating system breaks, the apartment is flooded, the boss insults you, a police officer mistakenly accuses you of something, etc. People read these vignettes, which you were supposed to do, and the only distinction in these vignettes is a couple of lines that suggest that the protagonist, the person in the story, is rich or poor. That's the only difference. And then we ask you, how uncomfortable is this person? How insulted is this person, etc. And what you find is a very powerful effect of a thick skin. People perceive the poor as having thick skin. They can take it. They're less insulted, they're less hurt. When you come to the hotel and the room is not available, the rich person is really upset. The poor person is used to this stuff, doesn't take it as seriously. That's what you get, and people put themselves exactly in the middle. Now, we've done this with different races, different ways. We've done this with kids and teachers. It's a very persistent effect. Even with kids, the kid is going to be less insulted, less encumbered, less upset if he's poor than if she's rich. And we need to think about this together. I'm not quite sure where this goes. So I'll give you a couple of data, pieces of data. As far as I can tell, people are using some kind of a heuristic of habituation. They think, you've gone through this long enough, you can take it one more time, you're thick-skinned. As far as we can tell from the data, that's basically mostly not correct. It's wrong. In the following sense, there's some nice data on a U-shaped function. Occasional discomforts can make you a little bit more robust, but repeated discomforts actually weaken you. Repeated insults in the workplace, repeated bullying, don't make you stronger. They make you collapse. So the idea that you get stronger with minor discomforts may be profoundly wrong. And it has really interesting implications because I'm talking about well-intentioned people, teachers. It suggests that there's a moment when the doctor can only see one patient and the other patient has to come back tomorrow. If you perceive the rich patient as being more encumbered by this, that's the one you'll take and send the poor patient to come back again the next day. There's in this perception, which interestingly doesn't even look insulting. There's something, you're strong, you can take it. It almost sounds like a compliment. In there is something very, very worrisome about the idea that since you've been used to this, you can take a bit more. That I was hoping to tell you that you do it too, but you were cautious. I'm pretty sure if you did our study, you would find yourself doing that too. And you are my dream audience because you're the ones whose intentions are very good. But I think there is an implicit tendency to assume that they can take it. The data is I'll give you one last example. When we wrote this initially, I said, look, there are some things people get used to. Like, for example, sleeping in noisy environments. So, you sleep in noisy environments every day. I sleep in the countryside when we're both in the city. Turns out that's wrong. Turns out that kids who grew up in a noisy environment at 15 sleep less well at night than those who are sleeping in a quiet place. After 15 years of training, they're more tired at school and they have more wake-sleep cycles than their friends in a quiet neighborhood. Even that you don't get used to. And so I think the tendency to think that they can take it may be actually quite negative in profound ways. Okay, some Q&A, I think we have time. Thank you. Do I choose? Any question? Yes.
Mine is just also a comment. I feel like you were following me around in 2006 to 2010. Because so much of what you talked, so much of what you talked about met me exactly where I was. Because in 2006, I started over with basically nothing. And it was not a life that I was accustomed to. I planned, I organized, I did all of those things. But it got to the point where I was basically living from day to day. I never knew how much money I was going to have from one moment to the next. And so I went from a person who planned because I knew to a person who was really stressed out all the time, trying to take care of 2 children and do all of these other things. And so it is, what you've talked about, it is very, very tough because it just bears down on you. And for me, my mind just runs 24/7 already. So it just went into overdrive. And so as my situation and my circumstances have evolved, one of the challenges that I've had to face is stepping away from every single day. So continuing to see myself in a part of scarcity. And so it's just really interesting, but it's extremely challenging, very challenging.
So thank you for that. this reminds me to make one important comment. When I talk about the poor showing diminished cognitive capacity when juggling, I should have said this earlier, the poor here, you should not have in mind an image of a homeless person in the corner. These are people who are having a hard time finishing the month. We're talking, I don't know, 120 million Americans. So this is not a select group. This is a third of the nation who are functioning at less than full cognitive capacity by being worried about how they're going to pay their rent and their school fees. And so this is a very important point. I think 1 minute, just because you touched on this, about getting away. We did a study where we invited people to simply be mindful and spend a minute on a vacation on this beach. So I say to you, spend 60 seconds, just think about what it would be like to be on the beach today. Walk through the sand, splash in the water, think what it's going to be like. And while you do this, in a random moments, I'm going to flash words, and you have to say yes words, not words. Classic cognitive psych test. Some of these words are beach scene related, and others are finance related. And basically, what we show is that the rich participants respond faster to beach-related words while they're being lost at the beach, and slower to finance-related words. The poor continue to identify money-related words faster and are unable to identify the beach-related. They cannot lose themselves in the beach, basically, related to your point. Very hard to do when you're juggling this need. Yes, all the way in the back.
Hi, Mary Bogle from the Urban Institute. I am sort of caught up in, and I know a lot of folks do coaching in this room. Like coaching is a big thing in 2Gen, and that's great. I love coaching models, actually. But I have a question about coaching models that has to do with behavioral research. How fast do people recover from cognitive deficits or any of the effects of scarcity and stress? Like there's that sugarcane study that showed people sort of snapped back quickly. And one of the things I understand about coaching models is that they're sort of predicated on, a number of them are predicated on the idea that this is a slow burn situation where you're making nudges, you're sort of moving people. So, and the idea is that they recover over time. Whereas, what if I just came in and instead of coaching somebody, I slapped 50,000 on the table and said, go fix your problems with that? You know, I mean, what's the difference in recovery? Like, would the person with the 50,000 bucks recover much faster than coaching?
You're touching on many issues here, which are all terrific questions, and I hope you asked them for a long time. The answers are complicated. Look, you had a whole session yesterday about neuroscience. Obviously, the kid who grew up with neural deficits takes a lot longer to recover than the person I'm talking about who just gets rid of the 7-digit number. You know, if instead of remembering they wrote it down, they're free again. So I'm talking about very fluid differences having to do with cognitive load. There are other issues that have to do with, gray matter, which are a very different temporal perspective, both in terms of producing and recovering from. Your point, look, I'm not kidding when I'm saying that's exactly the right question, and I would ask that every time you want to teach something. So look, if I want to send you a message to remember something specific, there's very good reason to do this to you after payday than before. I just think you have more mind to pay attention to it. Let's say you have to send $10 to the kids' school trip. If I get you in a moment when you're less overwhelmed, you're just more likely to do it. If there are things that you sign, if you look at some of the pay more tomorrow, save more tomorrow 401k programs, the brilliant thing about them is I have to have you sign it once, and then it happens to your bank account from then on without you having paying attention. That's a case where, one touch is all I need, as opposed to remember taking medication 4 times a day, which never stops. So these are the kind of things you have to ask yourself. What can I teach you? What can I not? And like when I touched on the financial literacy, if I lecture at you at a moment when you're not open to it, I'm not just wasting your time, I'm sort of insulting you because you know it already. You know you should save money, thank you very much. It's just hard to do. Why are you lecturing me? This is where we get into a very tricky territory that I think we have to be very sensitive to. Yes?
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed the research that you presented. I know there's some other research in education that goes along with what you're saying, but and adds to the fact that it's about perception. So I don't know if you've read the New Teachers Project report that recently came out, and it basically pointed to the fact that especially low-income students of color who are in classrooms with white teachers typically are given curriculum that's below grade level, even if the student is capable of doing the work. And that teachers are more likely not to use the curriculum that's been given to them, but they create curriculum that's below grade level because of their perception of students.
Yeah.
So again, when you were talking about how we create classrooms and increase gaps for students, a lot of that has to do with perception as well.
I agree, and I think it touches on this point. Look, the poor teacher gets there in the morning and the student is falling asleep, or is not dressed well, or is not behaving well, is having disciplinary problems. We know data that, 3 weeks after food stamps, I have more disciplinary problems in school than a week after food stamps. The teacher, unless she's massively sophisticated, looks and says, this student doesn't care, is not paying attention, is not capable. And so, this is a list, all of which, if you read Elijah Anderson, there's a sociologist in Philly who describes the life of the good as opposed to the street kids. I've always been impressed by that because he describes a good kid who leaves his good home in the morning dressed in good clothes, and he has to make it to school through the street. And what Elijah describes is that you leave home, you change into your street clothes, make it to the street, and get back into your good clothes to go into the school. My kids can make it in time changing clothes once, not 3 times. This is small things that accumulate in the teacher. What the teacher sees is that you're late. So totally right, and it's a very complicated challenge to have the teachers to see through this. Not to mention, of course, the racial issues, but I'm saying even if you put those aside for a moment. So yes, thank you. Yes.
Hi, Mariana Chilton, Philadelphia. We've met before. It's
Yes.
great to see you. I really enjoyed this, and I love it, and I buy it. And one thing that I think it really worries me about this concept of scarcity is that we're not thinking about the other side of scarcity, and that's exploitation, discrimination, oppression, gender discrimination, et cetera. And we're spending so much time thinking about how we can ease up the issue of scarcity for people who are poor. What can we do to take all of this wisdom that you have developed and this insight to nudge the wealthy and the corporate structures and the pay scales and the kinds of things that government and corporations do to exploit the poor, to nudge them to be less exploitative, to create less scarcity for the poor?
Right. So look, I can't do everything. I do what I do. But a little bit more seriously, look, I always say that when you look at the data, you have to decide how much of it is naivete and how much is malice. And very often it's not clear. When a policy is designed in a way that nobody takes it up, is it because I'm sophisticated enough to have designed in a way where my state doesn't have to pay the money? Or my intention is good and I just don't have an insight into how to get people to show up? So this is a question that often lurks in the background. I have chosen to do most of my work under the assumption of naivete. And in that world, I have the comfort to assume that if we get people to see the way things really are, they will be good enough, or at least not malicious enough, not to improve them. Having said that, no doubt, I mean, if somebody intends to hurt minorities, blacks, the poor, Jews, whatever, I don't know how to go there. But I think it's not a terrible assumption to start with this. I think most government, look, at the end of the day, what happens is controlled not by the president, but by mayors and people like you, and most of these people have very good intentions. So I think if they have better understanding of what it is that's driving people, how to design programs that ameliorate their well-being, they'd be open to it, all else equal, one hopes. But, a fair question. Time's up, last one.
Hi, I'm Laura Cohn from San Diego from the Workforce Development Organization, working there the past couple of years. The main thing I'm struck with is how much our systems are designed to catch cheats. So we're constantly making our participants prove that they're poor, prove again that they're poor, prove that they're still poor. It's very onerous and takes a lot of their time. We make them show up at various different agencies to prove over and over again that they're not cheating us. So I just wondered about the psychology on top of the psychology of scarcity, the psychology that comes from systems that are constantly accusing you of lying and cheating.
Yeah, obviously a big issue. So Anne knows, and some people here know, I've been trying to get involved a bit in narrative change, the idea of changing the narrative around what the poor are like and what made them poor and how they behave and what they want and what they think. It's a complicated story. The Gates Foundation had a group that spent a couple of years studying this stuff, and a couple of us, Jen Poole, who was a domestic workers organizer, and I and a few others are looking into this. Here is a fact. Take a sentence like, luck has a lot to do with being rich or poor. Most people disagree. The poor are just not trying hard enough. Most people agree. The last two facts I gave you, most people, I should have said most Americans. Europeans see it the opposite. For a long time, I was walking around saying, I don't want to change people, just make them more European. Turns out, the sad fact is the Europeans are becoming more like us than the other way around. So there's now data showing that as you increase the number of dark, in Europe, particularly Middle Eastern people, redistributive tendencies diminish. So they're becoming more American. So this is a deep issue in our nature. But yes, a lot of what you're describing is about a narrative that's probably profoundly wrong. Look, I have colleagues, wonderful colleagues, who teach people about people choosing unemployment as a matter of taste. It's probably insanely wrong, but they still think it. They think that, you give me a job for $2 a week or this, and I choose unemployment. They don't see the fact that it's all about dignity and pay. So I think we have a narrative problem that's, I think, lurks in all of what we're doing here. And again, it's back to the same thing. You hope that if you give people insight into the same person who a minute ago disappointed you, now looking so much better. Look, it's self-interest. If you run a McDonald's, and I could convince you that if you gave your workers a schedule not 2 days in advance, with a chance to scramble for childcare, but 2 weeks in advance, you'd have somebody who sleeps better and makes less mistake in the work they're doing for you. It's self-serving. It's that narrative one has to